Intellectual humility is an essential aspect of this. Intellectual humility is not something that is commonly very prominent in the psychology of well-known scientists and researchers. Nevertheless, in their research, intellectual humility is absolutely needed for them to be able to make scientific analyses that are not hopelessly infected by their own belief systems. The point as that is shown here is that intellectual humility on average leads to more accurate conclusions. There are exceptions to this. Unfortunately, those exceptions sometimes come come to be considered to be more important than the instances when this was the case, when people were able to overcome their belief systems. We're frequently presented with anecdotal evidence of the triumph of one person's belief in their own way of looking at things that overcomes everyone else's and establishes a new way of considering these things. This happens. Uh, it's preferable if it happens on the basis of analysis rather than on the basis of pure bullheadedness, because bullheadedness is vastly more likely to lead to narrowing of the ways in which we consider things rather than improved accuracy of the ways in which we consider things. So the four components of intellectual humility are respect for other viewpoints, respect not necessarily being agreement, but respect that they have a right to exist and that they are valid within the context of the people who hold those views. Uh, Lack of intellectual overconfidence. This has to do with what I was talking about before, basically lack of bullheadedness in colloquial English. And this is quite useful because it enables us to have a more flexible viewpoint uh, in order to consider various possible ways of looking at a given system or problem that can help us to solve it. Separation of ego and intellect. Separation of ego and intellect is very useful because it enables us to overcome the kind of battles that we sometimes see in not only in politics but also in in academia, where you see individuals who are successful in their area of of work, uh, and people who are successful in their area of work are very often successful by dint of applying themselves unsparingly to the accomplishment of certain tasks that enable them to get to the top of their profession. And that often is accompanied by a large ego. But if that large ego takes over their research and analysis, then it limits their ability to understand from an overall perspective. Willingness to revise your viewpoint. Uh, it's critical. Uh, so it's helpful in order to cultivate this willingness to revise your viewpoint, to travel, to live among people with different perspectives, to to read books with a different point of view, or magazine articles, uh, or expose yourself to different points of view. Um, this is unfortunately why social media is problematic in terms of teaching people how to understand others, because it shows you only points of view that agree with your own. And so those kinds of algorithms take effort to overcome. And it's a useful effort because it, uh, if you undertake the effort to go outside your own cone of understanding to listen to the viewpoints of other people, then it reduces your resistance to taking a more overall, more objective perspective on the belief system of those other people. And that doesn't mean that you agree. It means that you have a better understanding from the human perspective of how they arrived at that understanding. These are examples, not so much examples, but just ways of operating that can help people to have to exhibit intellectual humility. You try to falsify your opinions. In other words, you question the weak aspects of your own beliefs to see if they are falsifiable and therefore if they are belief systems or if they are actually scientifically verifiable points of view. Uh, or also, you can put yourself into the shoes of someone who grew up with a different ethnicity, religion, nationality, political persuasion, sex, gender, analytical approach, etc., etc. Different perspective, in other words. Keep in mind that there are two contexts that are going on whenever you are looking at someone else. They're the context of yourself as the inquirer and the context of the person or set of persons that you're looking at uh, as the topic of your analysis. So each of them have their own perspective. Those perspectives, neither of those perspectives are necessarily true, but they're the ones that you have. And so they frequently can bend your analyses in ways that lead them to be non-objective. So one example that I give here is Marxists or capitalists. Both of those are belief systems. Marxism and capitalism both pretend that they are objectively valid. Uh, that is not true. They're they're both within the context of a certain social outlook. And so should be understood as belief systems, not as objectively valid scientific concepts. Similarly, with someone who was looking at uh, a for example an economic system or an economic situation, economists often think of industries as if they were competitive because it's the so-called simplified point of view. This this warps our perspective because industries are not necessarily competitive. In most instances, they are not. And so, therefore, in most cases, industries do not operate the way that we describe them as operating in our basic texts. And unless the instructor clarifies and constantly hammers away at the fact that in real life, economies and companies and industries do not operate as, in such a way as if those industries were all competitive, then then you come away with a misunderstanding of how economies are actually operating in practice, which is problematic. So what the instructor should do in order to promote a scientific perspective in students is to not only talk about the theory as presented in the textbooks, but also about the reality, which is frequently a counterexample to what is described in the textbooks. Not as a way of disproving the textbooks, but as a way of clarifying that reality is more complex and more interesting. Thank you very much. There will be a third video to follow.